Welcome to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
When did UFO research actually begin? What were some of the strangest cases? And what were the conclusions?
Greetings and welcome to the 854th edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. I'm Ben, and those lofty questions came from my co-host, partner in paranormal adventures, and dad, Paul. And today we bring you a new guest with an unusual angle on a familiar subject. And we welcome your calls today. It's 401-766-1240. That is from anywhere. Or you can email paul@behindtheparanormal.com or contact us via Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram for those who are not so vocally inclined.
And I've known about him for many, many years, but this is the first time he's been on the show. We're very glad to have him. Nigel Watson has researched and investigated many historical and contemporary reports of UFO sightings and has co-authored several articles about phantom airships seen over Britain in 1909 and 1913. A wider survey of these reports is contained in his e-book titled The Origin of UFOs, Phantom Airships 1807 to 1917. Nigel also is the author of Portraits of Alien Encounters, 1990, Supernatural Spielberg with Darren Slade in 1992, and was writer of The Scare Ship Mystery, A Survey of Phantom Airship Scares, 1909 and 1918, published in 2000. In addition, he has written for numerous books, publications, and websites, including How It Works, All About Space, All About History, 40 in Times, Strange Magazine, and many more. Nigel holds degrees in psychology and film and literature. He lives in Plymouth, Devon, in England. He can be contacted at nigelwatson@gmail.com, and he is prominent on Facebook.
So, Nigel Watson, welcome to Behind the Paranormal.
Hello. Good to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you with us.
Good to hear that Devon accent. We have a lot of family in Devon.
Well, I've got more of an up-north accent. I sort of drifted southwards from Scunthorpe to London, and then I ended up in Plymouth. So.
Oh my goodness! It's a wonder we can understand you at all.
Yeah.
So take us away, Ben.
Alrighty. So let's just jump right into it, I suppose. So what was the earliest UFO case you know of, where an attempt was made at an investigation, and what were the conclusions?
All right. Well, there's quite a few contenders for that, but for an official investigation, I'd look at the First World War, where Britain had quite a few sightings of lights in the sky, and people thinking that Germans and spies in Britain were signalling into their airships at sensitive locations. And what happened was the Ministry of Defence had a department, Ministry of Intelligence, and they decided they should investigate any interesting cases of anything seen in the sky, in case it is a German spy activity. And what happened was they published a report on how to investigate what we call UFO sightings now, and it looks at how you should take information from witnesses, what information were needed that was essential to eliminate things like Venus and meteors and kites and balloons and things like that. So in a way, this is almost like a predecessor of Project Blue Book procedures, and it's quite an interesting document actually, but shows you that even in those days there were plenty of other things going on in the sky that could be, explained as something mundane, because it was a bit of a curse to the services to keep getting reports from local civilians and police forces about an airship constantly flying over dockyards or military establishments, and then they have to find out that it's really just what we used to call war nerves, and that people were highly sensitive to anything weird going on. So although strictly speaking, I suppose it's not really UFOs in the sense that we look at them now, it was still dealing with things seen in the sky and related to that particular situation. There were quite interesting reports of seen German motor vehicles driving down country lanes, shining lights up at airships and guiding them to targets. And also people reported seeing lights on hilltops. And in Scotland, there were quite a few rumours that there was an airship base operated by the Germans, and there was something like a £200 reward for anyone who could supply information to track down their base. And also, we were looking out for anyone who bought a lot of gasoline or, was suspicious in the area. And also in the Lake District, they sent out Boy Scouts and people to search for any German aviators. And they even sent a British pilot up north to have a look for any, German air bases. But because aircraft were quite unusual in them days, sending the pilot up only sent more people to report strange things in the sky when it was really their own aircraft. So perhaps that just confused things as well. But, so it wasn't that great. But obviously sightings way before the First World War, the great United States airship scare of 1896 to 97. But there weren't any official investigations. There tended to be one-off newspaper reports and stories. So, and also people thought it was some secret inventor. So at any time people expected a big revelation that the person would land in public and make a big press statement, which never happened. Quite a few people did come forward to say they had invented it, but they never come up with any evidence. And so mainly it was just sort of one-off newspaper stories, and there wasn't really any reason to investigate, what was going on behind it. And it was, with the First World War, there obviously was a reason to investigate, what was going on in our skies. And also it did, with the British cases, there were a few interesting incidents where a pilot did see an unusual object or light moving in the sky, and he actually took a revolver and shot at it. So that's probably one of the earliest cases where somebody actually took a shot at a UFO, because there was no determination of it being a real German airship in that particular area. And normally the activity of any invading German airships were quite well planned by the Ministry of Defence. So, what that pilot saw is hard to say, but he took a shot at it anyway. And another case which was attributed to the Red Baron, this is a sort of hoax story, but I mention it in my book. I did a follow-up book called UFOs of the First World War, and basically it has about the same information as my earlier scareship book, but I've put together some new bits of information we found. And the Red Baron case is a story that was told several years later, and is almost certainly a hoax. But it's interesting because it tells of a Red Baron shooting at a classical flying saucer, and then it's shot down and it crashes to the ground, and then two aliens get out of the spaceship and run into the forests in Germany. And it's an interesting case just because it plays on this idea of the iconic image of a Red Baron being all invincible sort of thing, shooting down a sort of high-tech flying saucer. So it brings together, our modern-day world and the old world. It's almost like a steampunk event. And it's an entertaining story, but if you start looking into it, lots of the facts unravel. But it does turn up in a few UFO books as sort of real. So I mentioned it in my book anyway.
Yeah.
But I suppose that's a frustrating thing about ufology. The best cases are usually the least valid, really, and perhaps some little light in the sky case has perhaps got better witnesses and evidence than something which sounds a lot more at first value to be something from beyond our planet. And I think that's the whole thing with my research, really, is that we've got the flying saucer period now, but in the past there were things like phantom airships before the First World War in several countries, but were all generated either by the interest in inventors or just fear of war. In Britain in particular, we feared the German Zeppelins, so obviously anything seen in the sky became a sort of German Zeppelin. Even if it was a little light in the sky or something, it often got heightened into being searchlights of a Zeppelin searching out targets for future bombing and helping develop invasion plans. So it was part of the bigger aspect of people just being worried about a future war. And there was also no body of literature about future war with Germany, which some featured airships as well, because it was such a potent weapon, and people imagined that if the Germans could bomb London, Germany would invade Britain very quickly afterwards. So, it was something people didn't know the impact of Zeppelins on warfare, really. So it was something people were very frightened about. And you can compare it really with the flying saucer scare. People were frightened of what the flying saucers were. People originally thought there might have been Soviet weapons that could decimate the United States and undermine democracy. And then it kind of transmuted into the threat of, aliens from outer space. So, it's often things seen in the sky are seen in the context of the social conditions and, what our own expectations are.
At what point, Nigel, did people start to think of extraterrestrials as explanations for these lights in the sky rather than Germans or Soviets or whatever?
Yeah. Well, occasionally it cropped up. I think Charles Fort actually wrote to the New York Times suggesting that things seen in the sky were down to spaceships. I think that was in the 1920s. And even in 1909, there are one or two letters by people suggesting that they could be from Mars, because obviously the War of the Worlds was very popular at that time as a novel. So people were thinking about life on Mars, but it was kind of done as a kind of a joke and aside. And even Charles Fort, who obviously collected tons of material about odd events, he sort of played with the idea that odd things in the sky were from outer space or somewhere beyond our own scientific understanding. But he kind of did it from a sort of philosophical and humorous point of view, so you weren't always sure if he was really serious about it. But obviously there was a Fortean Society was existent during the Second World War, and so it was kind of already there to sort of pounce on flying saucers when they did become, when it became a name, 1947. So there's already a kind of background interest, and of course there's all these stories of Foo Fighters seen by United States Air Force pilots during the Second World War over Germany and over the Far East. So, and also there were ghost rockets seen shortly after the Second World War. So by that time there were already a lot of things going on in the sky that people thought were strange. So in a way, when Kenneth Arnold said he saw these saucer-like objects, and the term flying saucer came, we had a sort of umbrella term then to explore, virtually anything to do with things seen in the sky become a flying saucer. But I suppose that was a bad thing, really, because, the majority of things aren't classic flying saucers. Even Kenneth Arnold saw sort of delta-shaped craft rather than, the classic round spinning saucer you get in all the B movies. But despite it not being as descriptive as it should be, it's a great umbrella term, really. And also, it's brought in things like Men in Black, psychic phenomena, and, virtually anything unknown can come into the flying saucer umbrella, really. And there again, that's a sort of interesting area for some people to study, and some people think perhaps it's just another confusing factor to stop us, looking at the actual, nuts and bolts facts,
No. Now, we have a question from a very faithful listener of ours in South America, and Ben, if you would present from Peter in Bogota, Colombia.
I sure can. So Peter writes to us, in your book titled The Scareship Mystery, a survey of phantom airship scares from 1909 to 1918, what are some of the most interesting cases and writing in the book that you were able to research German archives, and what did you discover? So
I guess to extrapolate on what you've already said.
We didn't actually look at any German archives. I've myself and Granville Odroyd, who did a lot of the basic research, he found in the British archives lots of material from the War Office, and but we didn't do a parallel study of German files. I'm not even sure if there is such material available, because obviously with the two world wars, I think a lot of German archives got destroyed. But it would be fantastic if somebody, a German-speaking person, could actually look into that. Most of our data comes from the English-speaking world as well. It comes from Canada, USA, New Zealand, Australia, even South Africa had a scare in the beginning of the First World War, where they thought German aviators were flying over Cape Town, and there was quite a worry that the Germans would be flying over South Africa. But looking into the information about their air force, they only had a few aircraft that weren't really capable of much. So I think there again the South African sightings were more due to a kind of war panic than any real aircraft about. And the same happened in the United States and Canada. The sightings of aircraft were often associated with worries about German spying activities. In fact, there was quite a good story there by a pilot who went to Canada and said he bragged that he'd had a dogfight with German pilots over the sort of American-Canadian border. But that story, I think he made up just to brag to people, but it got published in a local paper. So it shows people were interested in that sort of idea of aerial combat, really, and also that people, fabricated stories as well as people genuinely thinking there were, aircraft over their city or town that was of German origin. So, but other than that, we didn't really research much into Germany. I know the different. I think the Germans did have similar rumours. There's things like the British Angel of Mons, when the British Army retreated from the Germans at Mons. There were rumours that angels were visible to the British soldiers who helped guide them away from being destroyed by the Germans. And there are several accounts in German literature of also German soldiers seeing their own patron saints or protective figures protecting them. And perhaps that's something else the stress of war brings out, that people, if exhausted and tired and in a very stressful situation, when they do survive it, they sometimes attribute it to some salvation figure. And back then it was like an angel or Saint Michael or somebody like that, or angels. Whereas today people perhaps think like contactees used to, that beings from outer space are protecting them. So things change over time. I don't know whether it's because some people say it's alien influences attuned to the human mind, or it could be just that the human mind is attuned to things that they like to think is beyond their ken, and it just might be a psychological mechanism rather than something out there. So I think that's something we're constantly looking at as UFO investigators. Is it really out there or in our own minds? And often it can be a fine combination of both those factors, really, especially in more complex cases or in cases which involve several people.
That's a really actually interesting point, and one that I kind of wanted to circle back to. When we first started our conversation, the first question that came to my mind was, would there be more sightings during wartime? But you brought up the fascinating idea of war nerves, and especially when it comes to sort of the traumatic experience of war in every sort of facet of it, whether you're a civilian or a soldier. That brings up a fascinating sort of question, which is it that it's not real and it's all in our minds? Our neural synapses are kind of just firing off, because stress can affect everybody, whether it's the stress of failing an exam or the stress of being shot at. It's still the same thing that we're being affected by. Whether the gravity of the situation is completely different, it still affects us. Does that make this experience any less real, I suppose? Yeah,
I think that's interesting, because a lot of people say in the United States has often said that military bases seem to be the focus of UFO activity, which raises the question, is it because outside UFOs are coming there, or is it that people are more aware of things going on in the sky and are attuned to anything unusual? It's interesting, like Roswell, it was near a nuclear strategic base, and Area 51 is another example, really, of is it stuff they're actually testing there, or is it outside forces coming there? And I think in every conflict there have been scares involving things in the sky, like I said, with Foo Fighters or German Phantom airships. And I think a lot of them can be attributed to war nerves, but like with flying saucers, there are the odd case where you just can't explain them. David Clarke in Britain has investigated Foo Fighter cases. There's a particular one where a Foo Fighter seems to chase a Lancaster bomber, and it they make quite a lot of manoeuvres to try and free themselves of this illuminated object, and finally do lose it. But it sounds more than somebody's hallucinating. But on the other hand, the Germans didn't have such a weapon, and also the British did study Foo Fighter reports, and they couldn't really come up with a solid answer for all of them. But on the other hand, they thought, well, they don't do any damage, they don't shoot at aircraft, they don't shoot them or damage them or cause them to crash. So in a way, although they're puzzling, they weren't dangerous. So in a way, they could sort of dismiss them on that side of the equation, and it was quite easy just to call it war nerves. But I think quite a few people, even after the war, have reported similar experiences, and it obviously stayed with them. So it does make you wonder what was going on then, and whether, what would trigger such things. You'd think if you were exhausted in a war situation, you might more likely see things like angels and things like that, like they did in the First World War. Perhaps, what we hang on for salvation changes over time. Perhaps as we get more secular, we grasp for more technological gods. It's one of those things where you kind of you can look at it different ways, really. But also we've got Rendlesham Forest incident, where again it's another a base where UFO activity seemed to occur. So there do seem to be hot spots for UFO activity.
Yes.
And I don't know if you've heard of Warminster. That was another prominent place in Britain, particularly in the 60s, and that's near a lot of army training bases and things. So, that does flag up the fact that, if you go anywhere military inspired, there's likely to be a history of UFO activity around it. So, I think it depends on how you look at the subject to determine what you believe about that.
All right. Well, we'll take our mid-show break now. You're listening to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on WOON 1240 AM and 99.5 FM in New England's beautiful but really hot Blackstone Valley today with our guest, Nigel Watson. We'll be right back, so stick with us.
The night is alive. Join us and take a walk on the weird side when you tune in to The Kingdom of Nye, hosted by Heather Wade, the finest in late night talk. Listen live free weeknights starting at 9 p.m. Pacific time at thekingdomofnye.com, talkstreamlive.com, and the Paranormal Radio app. Wanna take a ride?
Local and live at 99.5 FM.
And welcome back to Behind the Paranormal here on ON 1240 AM and FM. And we're here with, of course, Ben, our producer and co-host, and also our great guest coming all the way from the UK today, Nigel Watson. He didn't come all the way to be in the studio, unfortunately, but we have him via Skype, and we're very happy to have him with us. So, Nigel, let's go right to a question from a listener here. We have a very faithful listener, Phil, in Orange, Massachusetts. And he has a question for Nigel.
Phil writes to us, greetings, gentlemen. I have a question concerning the legendary and possibly apocryphal airship crash in Aurora, Texas in 1897. It's taken for granted that an airship crashed into a windmill and that it's thought the occupants were buried in a local cemetery. However, in 1988, the issue of Fate magazine, a researcher writes that there isn't any record of a windmill on the farm in question. Even more damning is the fact that detailed histories of Aurora were published within the next 5 to 10 years, and neither of them ever mention an airship crash. Any thoughts?
This is a fantastic case from the famous 1896-97 airship scare. And that's one of the better incidents where it was alleged it had crashed into this windmill, and that sort of Martian pilot had been found inside it. I think they'd also seen hieroglyphics or something inside the craft. And so that's what made them think it was a Martian. But like you say, there wasn't a windmill at the site, and also they said they buried the body and I think they buried the body in the local cemetery and put all the wreckage down the local well. And then much later, this story sounded really amazing to people who dug the newspaper reports up in the 1960s. But then when people did a bit more digging into the real story, it seems like it was a sort of just a hoax made up to entertain people in the local paper. And also, it makes you wonder if a genuine Martian spaceship did crash, why would you bury the evidence, really? You'd be happy to put it on display or sell it, or just make it worldwide knowledge. Why bury it all? But even though it has been exposed as a hoax, people still go to Aurora and try to dig up the astronauts' remains, and I think there's an actual plaque at the cemetery. And I think that underlines also that there were a lot of cases during that scare in America that were hoaxes. There's another one of a calf being lassoed and kidnapped by an airship, and then a few days later the remains of a mutilated calf is found on the ground. That again was a hoax. But the interesting thing about that story is it sort of has the whole thing about a strange object in the sky, a kidnapping and cattle mutilation, which all become themes in the 1970s. And also with the airship crash, it's very like a prototype Roswell, really.
Yes, definitely. Well, I'm thinking there's also one thing that spread the story, I think, was a 1986 film called The Aurora Incident, in which that was told, that story, and it sticks in my mind because the governor of Texas was played by, of all people, Spanky McFarland, who was a child star in the Our Gang comedies of the 1930s and 40s, and he looked exactly the same, only big and old. So anyway, that's what made it stick in my mind. But it was a charming story if you have a chance to see it. But whether it's true is another issue.
But that's the whole thing. It's like the Red Baron incident. They kind of got a cinematic quality to them, and it'd be brilliant if they didn't make a film about the Red Baron incident. But with the Aurora, Texas case, it's kept on, and I think some stories have said that the township enjoys having that because it becomes a tourist attraction, and same with Roswell, really, and that certain areas have exploited their UFO legacy for the benefit of tourism.
Oh yes.
But strangely enough, in Warminster, if you ever go there, it's a sleepy little town in Wiltshire, you'd hardly see any sign of UFOs unless you go up Cradle Hill. You might see a little bit of alien graffiti, but in Britain we've kind of repressed it all and hid it all away. It seems quite fascinating compared to, say, Roswell and or even Area 51. I think the more they don't want people to go to Area 51, the more people go there. So
yeah, I've been to that vicinity and had a rather disconcerting experience being chased by government agents, but apparently, anyway, some years ago. Anyhow, Nigel, I know that certainly in your book, the Origins of UFOs, you referred to a case as far back as 1807. And that's before there were airships, as far as we know. There were only rudimentary balloons, that sort of thing. What was that about, that case?
Well, to be honest, I can't remember that far back myself.
Okay.
But
well, you don't look old enough to remember the 1907. Never mind.
Yeah. The thing is, though, it's funny because if you look back into old newspaper files, virtually any year you might find a sighting of something unusual in the sky, because we tend to think of it as a modern phenomenon. But if you go right back to 1807 or something, people were seeing odd lights in the sky and things. And if you go even further back, there are lithographs of people showing balls of light and cannonball-like things falling from the sky. Some of the artistic representations might be of thunder and lightning or meteors and comets, but people did think of things in the sky as being wondrous, and often that they presage great events, and so they were kind of used in a sort of astrological sense. It's a bit like today, I suppose, if people see UFOs and evidence of alien encounters, so tend to think, something life-changing is going to happen, but there will be government disclosure of the apocalypse or, something revolutionary. So even going back in time, people were always aware of the implications of weird things going on in the sky. But things like mainly there were lights in the sky, and some of them can be just astronomical or something, but some are quite unusual. Sometimes astronomers also saw strange things passing in front of the lenses as well, and it made people speculate that there were orbiting planets or something extraterrestrial not far beyond Earth and the Moon, really. But people like Jack Valley have looked at a lot of these ancient cases, and they've tried pinning down explanations for them, but some are genuinely quite interested in the light of the modern day UFOs.
Well, there is. I'm thinking too. If we can push this all further back, there would be, for example, when we were researching, working in Rendlesham Forest in 2012, the last time we were there, we encountered. Our theory is that it was a flap area, as we call it. Many different kinds of paranormal activity that aren't traditionally associated with one another do take place in that vicinity. And within 20 to 30 miles of Rendlesham Forest, you've had the, I believe it's pronounced Aldeburgh Sky Battle, which occurred during the 1600s and was well attested by a number of people, and apparently there were craft in the sky. And again, this is the 17th century. Apparently, zooming around, doing battle, and other sightings were seen closer to the ground. And then you can go back, I suppose, as far back as the cave paintings at Uluru in Australia. And I've been to Australia. I haven't been to Uluru, but I've seen. But the amazing cave paintings of what appear to be people with helmets, discs with people on, Bigfoot, if you wish, or Yeti. So can we say that perhaps UFO sightings, if not investigations, can go back to perhaps 30,000 years?
Yeah, it's great looking back at some cave paintings and things like that show quite unusual things, because some of the other things like animals and people look fairly realistic in terms of how we represented things. So it makes you wonder what the more bizarre things with helmeted creatures and things are. I think it's difficult though, because if you go so far back in time, how to interpret things. I'm quite interested in stone circles and things like Stonehenge and prehistoric locations, because they do give off a certain mystical aura, and people have seen UFOs near prehistoric sites, and of course Wiltshire and Warminster are very much in the heart of Stonehenge territory and other prehistoric remains. So it does make you feel that there is a link back in history to things like that. But I suppose on the other hand, it's very difficult to track down, what the real meanings were. I think if you look at a lot of ancient texts and things, sometimes they're quite ambiguous, and perhaps it might be the equivalent of modern day comic books. Perhaps in 1,000 years' time, people think Superman was a real being and went around flying around saving people from criminal activity. So you never know. But I think that's the power of human imagination is also worth considering, really, as well. So, but I just find it fascinating all the different areas you can look at, really, and it does make you think twice about prehistoric remains and why they were built and their purpose. And but I don't think anyone's really pinned down the true meaning, and I suppose all we can do is speculate. But I think I get the same feeling with UFOs, really, but you can pin down so many facts, and then it's up to people's either faith or interpretation. Obviously somebody who's had intense abduction experiences is going to look at the subject differently from an investigator like myself who's never been abducted, as far as I know. So I think that's the situation, really, isn't it? And
excellent point. I think that the interpretation is everything, and of course we're sitting here at our pinnacle of glory here, our civilization, and looking back upon the literature and the customs and beliefs of people who we may be interpreting them entirely incorrectly.
Yeah, that's kind of like the whole trickiness of history in general, is we tend to look at things from our point of view, and it kind of clouds it a little bit. And this kind of does actually get to my next question. Well, it's more of an observation than a question, but I guess you could interpret it as a question. That there's sort of these two particular themes we've touched on throughout our time together today, and one of the major ones is perspective, but it kind of branches into two different areas. One is how it's dictated, sort of whether it's technology. At the time, we look at these reports of phantom airships, and we look at the technology of the time, and sort of it's the best way we can kind of interpret things is through the technology that exists then. But there's also another facet to perspective, which is sort of the zeitgeist, or the sort of spirit of the times, whether it's wartime sort of dictating a lot of these experiences, and then, post Roswell, where we're starting to kind of see more sci-fi type things into today, where arguably you could say that there's more of a sort of new agey view on UFOs in a sense, where they're less sort of nuts and boltsy things and more ethereal almost. If that makes more sense. So as time goes on, this is sort of a tricky question in any sort of area of study, which is what is sort of the next steps for ufology? How do we sort of interpret the history of our past in sort of the patterns as they unfold in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. There seems to be a fact and fiction back in the pre-First World War period. Not only were there lots of stories about developments in aviation, it was a very new science, and people nearly every day were breaking new boundaries and achieving new things. And also there was the imagination. People were wondering, what would aviation do to our lives? Would we all be flying around in aerial taxis and, cities in the sky and things like that? And also, would it mean modern warfare would be totally different? In Britain in particular, we have a Royal Navy that have ruled the world for so long, and then this barrier against foreign invasion was suddenly gone because the Germans could just fly over the Royal Navy. So, that was a massive threat for Britain. But there's also worries about that, the new technology stories coming out in the newspapers, and also there were, a few fictional films as well coming out about the dangers of war. There's a story that shows little guided missiles sent to knock down a German airship. So there's all this thing about new technology also brings in new ideas and new fiction and what's going to happen next. I suppose with ufology, things are move quite fast now with social media and the fact that there seems to be more stories about disclosure and the different revelations from the American studies in it, but there always seems to be a promise of something ahead, and it's always a bit disappointing, really, because since the 1950s onwards, there's always been people saying that we're going to get full disclosure, the government's going to reveal the alien presence, and you get a few really good cases. I suppose in America in 1952 there was lots of sightings over Washington.
Oh, and, yes. Big year for UFOs here.
Yeah, and it brought up a lot of worries about what the situation would bring about. And now we're getting these videos from United States Navy jets and different rumours of different programs to study UFO technology, but I find that quite frustrating, really, because it's a bit like Roswell, really, but people keep saying there are alien bodies and bits of evidence, wreckage and things like that, and they're all stored in Area 51 and things, but nobody can really get their hands on it, and it's same with most wreckage ascribed to UFO crashes. Always seems to disappear, or if it does turn up, it's a bit like alien implants, but they don't seem to come to any consequence. It's a matter of interpretation how exotic this piece of wreckage might be. I've always thought the Roswell wreckage always sounded a bit it sounded very flimsy, and there again it had hieroglyphics like the Aurora, Texas case, and it's almost like you've got to have a bit of squiggly hieroglyphic writings on bits of wreckage to prove they're alien, but it never sounded like a full-blown spaceship like we'd imagine from a science B movie, and so I think quite a few people have commented on the fact that ufology tends to be nostalgia. We're still looking at Roswell and Rendlesham, and nothing much has really happened except for these United States Navy jet footage. Nothing much has really occurred in the last few decades, and that it makes you wonder where ufology will go. And a lot of the ufologists that were quite prominent are beginning to die off as well, and I don't know whether much new is coming in. I think you mentioned there's a more of a new age side of things. People are looking at it more in terms of almost like hyper reality, that aliens can manipulate reality. So we are, if we do see UFOs or aliens, they act in a magical way from our point of view, but they are using a science, but a science far beyond our understanding. So it's still a kind of extraterrestrial theory, but making the alien activity far more beyond our own understanding. Whereas I think in the past, something like the 1950s, the alien invaders were just like a slightly moderner version of just human invaders that come, plunder, take people away, and that's the end of us, sort of thing.
No, it's very true, and I think that we're running out of time. But you sort of made the tradition into what could be another show about making the step from nuts and bolts craft from other planets to perhaps what is now referred to as ultra-terrestrials, or that's whatever. Maybe even time travelers or other versions of ourselves or multiversal visitors, that sort of thing. But I'm afraid we'll have to leave that to the next show. Nigel, tell us about your books, where people can find out more about you.
Well, my latest book is Captured by Aliens, a history and analysis of American abduction claims, where I look at how the subject came about through the Betty and Barney Hill case. And the abduction cases since then. That's through McFarland and through publishers and through Amazon and most other bookshops. And I've also done the UFOs of the First World War, which is the history press, and there again, that's available on Amazon. And both books are available on Kindle as well, which is quite a handy option. Okay. And I suppose both of them are sort of ways of putting a complex subject onto paper, really, and to show the different avenues of study. Because I think it's, if you're looking at the history or modern day ufology, they're quite complicated, and I've got quite a lot of different tributes to different areas to study. So I think to get it on paper, I bet me write it basically.
Okay, very good. Well, Nigel, that's about all the time we have. You are the middle and two ends of a fine fellow, and we're absolutely delighted to have you with us, and we'll have you back to take it farther, if we can. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So, Ben, we'll get into our announcements here. You're still fiddling with material, so I'll do it.
Thank you.
As we've been announcing on recent shows, the 2020 Exeter UFO Festival on Labor Day weekend has been canceled, but the 55th anniversary of the incident at Exeter will not go unsung on this show. On September 6th, the day we would have broadcast from the historic Exeter Town Hall with a panel of speakers and a live audience for the fifth year in a row, we will offer a rebroadcast of last year's panel show from there. On that panel were Kathleen Marden, Peter Robbins, Mac Maloney, Mike Stevens, and many other luminaries in the UFO field, including Jim Weiner and Charlie Foltz, two witnesses who actually were involved in the Allagash UFO abductions in the 1970s. Very, very interesting stuff. So the following week, September 13th, we'll bring you a very special guest, retired FBI agent Clinton Rand, who, as a Hampton, New Hampshire police sergeant in September 1965, was on duty at the police department desk during the incident at Exeter, which involved UFO encounters by several of his officers. On the day after that, what would have been the Exeter UFO Festival, September 7th, Labor Day in the U.S., Ben and I will be on the Travel Channel as part of the debut of The Devil's Road, the true story of Ed and Lorraine Warren. Why is stuff, we're always on TV and this title has devil in it. Devil's Hour. I mean, what is this?
I mean, what grabs your attention more than
whatever grabs your goat and swings it around by the tail. Anyway,
I suppose, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, that is the first in a new series of 2-hour documentaries on the Travel Channel, America's True Horror Stories. Anyway, I'm in it as someone who worked with the Warrens, and Ben is there to represent the new generation of researchers, and that will be the Travel Channel, 9 p.m. Eastern, Monday, September 7th, 2020.
And so we have high hopes that we can be back at the Greater New England UFO Conference in Leominster, Massachusetts. That's on Columbus Day weekend. My dad is scheduled to be the keynote speaker to mark his 50-year work anniversary in paranormal research. There are plans for an online conference if it cannot be held at the usual physical venue, and you can look for Shane there as well.
Yeah, Shane Searway, our guest co-host, big fellow on the show here. We have no final word yet, but rumor has it that another UFO event that takes place in October, namely the Western Connecticut UFO Conference, will indeed do so this year in the vicinity of Danbury, Connecticut. One form or another is determined to take place, and we think that's great. So stay tuned, literally, on that one.
And you can check out our books along with that of our other co-hosts on our show website. That's BehindTheParanormal.com. Where you can also find out more about the show, our many cases over the years, our public appearances, and how to book us along with some of our 850 free recorded shows from our 12-plus years on the air, and that includes our 4.5-year run on CBS Radio, along with special shows and podcasts. Past shows back to 2009 are also available on our major podcast platforms. That includes YouTube, iTunes, Apple Podcasts, the Paranormal Radio app, and more. And if you do happen to listen to us on Apple, please give us a rating and leave a review. It helps us feel good about ourselves, but also helps us grow our show.
And what's going on next week, Ben?
So next week we have, that's the first Sunday in August 2nd, renowned researcher Nadine Lalich will return to the show for the first time in 11 years to talk about ETs and the alien presence.
Okay, that's about all we have time for. I'm Paul Eno.
And I'm Ben Eno, and thanks for joining us on our great cosmic journey, and we shall see you next time on Behind the Paranormal.
Return to this radio frequency 167 hours from now for another edition of Behind the Paranormal with